Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Paris Schutz has the evening off. On the show tonight,
there were anywhere from 4 to 7 inches of accumulation.
It's the first major snowfall of the season. How the COVID pandemic makes it harder for the city's most vulnerable residents.
And will lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example.
Looking at President Biden's foreign policy approach as China's leader warns protectionist trade policies could lead to a new Cold War. Indoor dining is open in Chicago. We hear how some in the service industry feel about that move.
We and other cities around the world have found out the pandemic has played havoc with our ecosystem.
How businesses are hanging on in the Chicago Loop after this summer's civil unrest and 10 months of COVID shutdowns.
I will not be the last.
Breaking barriers, the significance of Vice President Kamala Harris holding the second highest office in the nation, and what challenges may lie ahead. And the Chicago Tribune's former architecture, restaurant, and music critics talk about their storied careers and the future of journalism. But first, some of today's top stories. Chicago Public Schools tells parents to keep their children home tomorrow as talks with the teachers union over in-person learning reach an impasse. Preschool and special needs students were given the option to return earlier this month, with K through 8 set to return next week. Today, the union told all of its members to work remotely starting tomorrow, even those who had already been working in schools these last few weeks, and told them to prepare for a possible strike on Thursday. In a statement, CTU President Jesse Sharkey says, quote, "We are willing to keep teaching, but CPS has said they will lock us out. We need a mediator to intervene and put our attempts to bargain a truly safe path to reopening back on track." And late this afternoon, Mayor Lori Lightfoot and school CEO Janice Jackson touted the district's safety efforts and said they've been working with the union for months.
CPS has demonstrated its good faith by, since June, meeting with the CTU leadership over 60 times. And in the last 2 weeks, virtually every day, including weekends. Meeting or exceeding the CDC and Chicago Department of Public Health guidelines. I am deeply disappointed that after all this time, all these sessions, all the work to make sure that our CPS schools and buildings are safe, no agreement has yet been reached.
And snowfall is finally letting up in parts of the Chicago area farther from the lake. As of this afternoon, snowfall as high as 7 inches was recorded in some suburbs. Lake effect snow is expected to continue this evening and into tomorrow. And we'll have more on the impact of the year's first major snowstorm in just a few minutes. Illinois regulators reject a bid by the owners of Mercy Hospital to open an outpatient center on the south side. Last month, regulators shot down a plan by the owner of the Bronzeville Hospital to close Mercy. Critics argued it's one of the South Side's busiest emergency departments and largely treats already underserved populations. In a 3-2 vote today, the state board that oversees healthcare projects also turned down a request to open an outpatient center 2 miles from the current hospital site, which was intended as a replacement. The proposal to shut down the hospital will be up for consideration again in March. And Illinois health officials report another 3,600 cases of coronavirus and 87 deaths since yesterday. The state's total number of cases stands at more than 1.1 million, with 18,883 lives lost. Some 300 vehicles have been plowing and salting Chicago roads, making the main arteries at least drivable despite the snow that's blanketed northern Illinois. Amanda Venicky joins us now to explain some of the science behind this storm and why it's presenting a challenge for some of the city's most vulnerable residents. Amanda.
Brandis, as Illinois' official climatologist, it is Trent Ford's job to follow storms like this one and then to study how weather patterns match up with years past. He also, by the way, teaches classes on climate science, and he says what we saw over the past 24 hours or so was a literal textbook example of the range of precipitation types that can come from large winter weather systems.
Depending on where you are, where the low pressure center is of the system, where that passes through, and where the warm air coming up versus the cold air coming down meet together.
So while the Chicago area got 4 to 7 inches of snow,
whereas when you go down further south towards here in Champaign, we got a little bit of snow, a little bit of rain, and a decent amount of ice, which forms from freezing rain. The liquid precipitation hits the surface and freezes immediately, as well as a little bit of sleet. If we go further down south of Springfield and I-70, was mostly precipitation, mostly rainfall.
Go further south than that, and you have last night's tornado in Alabama. Now, what is not textbook, it's, well, pretty late, about 2 to 4 weeks behind, for northern Illinois to see its first major snowfall that really sticks. He says most of the state also went into this storm behind for overall levels of snowfall for the season. Even with what is on the ground now, Chicago, he says, will still be behind for a typical year. Actually, he says, and then granted, there was that polar vortex, but we have strung together a few relatively mild winters. He says climate change means that temperatures are rising, and they're increasing at the largest rate in the winter versus other seasons. He says that means it will be less likely we are going to have prolonged stretches of super cold weather.
We can still get those cold air outbreaks. Those are definitely possible, as we saw in January 2019, but it's less likely that we'll have an entire month of well below average temperatures because of that background warming.
Now, as for snowfall, he says that's really variable. The total snowfall for a season can be dominated by just a couple of large snowfalls, storms like we're getting now. Milder winters and rising winter temps, by the way, does not mean that Chicago's winters are getting balmy.
It doesn't mean it's not cold. It's still winter. We still have an energy deficit and temperatures are still going to be cold. It's just that they're warming. And I'll also say that, projections, when we look at projections of future changes, those snowstorms, the yield of snow from snowstorms are projected to decrease as we continue to warm into the future. Still,
snowstorms, cold weather is a cause for concern for individuals experiencing homelessness. Usually when it's freezing cold or you have a whole lot of snow, Jeremy Nichols would
go and search around the neighborhood for those who are particularly vulnerable, and like under the viaducts, and offer them a place to stay in our cafeteria.
Using the cafeteria as a warming center, Nichols says, has saved some digits over the years. People who were at the point they couldn't feel their hands or feet had a place to go. Notice I said that is what he usually does.
We've had to make a lot of drastic changes this year.
Inviting people into the shelter, where many of the program's residents are older and immunocompromised, was not possible because of the coronavirus.
If we bring in a lot of people like we've done in the past that do have COVID, then we could possibly put everybody else at risk, from our participants to our staff, and then we couldn't staff what we're doing as well. And so it's a fine balance that we really do need to really take into consideration.
He says it is an eternal battle. He says it is hard knowing that there are people outside at risk of hypothermia and frostbite. Director of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, Doug Schenkelberg, says actually the city has done a decent job throughout the pandemic of addressing individuals' shelter needs.
So it's not so much a concern about whether or not shelters have sufficient beds. It's the factor of folks who are unsheltered oftentimes don't want to go into a shelter system, not because they don't need housing, but because they don't feel safe in that shelter system, and that's particularly heightened in the age of COVID.
Now, next week, those who live and who work at homeless shelters will begin to have access to the COVID vaccine because they are congregate settings. But Schenkelberg says that it is going to be important for those who are homeless and who are not in shelters to be able to get access to the COVID vaccine soon after. Many also have immunocompromised systems. Brandis, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And now to Phil Ponce and a look at President Biden's foreign policy plans. Phil.
Brandis, the Biden administration faces a host of foreign policy challenges. Only yesterday, in a virtual address to the World Economic Forum, China's president warned of a new Cold War if countries keep pushing protectionist trade policies in what was seen as a thinly veiled attack on the U.S. Biden also has to contend with the impact of 4 years of an America First approach that has strained old alliances. He addressed those challenges in his inauguration speech last week.
Here's my message to those beyond our borders. America has been tested, and we've come out stronger for it. We will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today's and tomorrow's challenges.
Joining us now on their expectations for the new administration's foreign policy are Cecile Shea, a non-resident senior fellow on security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and a foreign policy specialist, and Alberto Cole, professor of law and U.S. foreign relations at DePaul University. Thank you all for joining us. Cecile Shea, let me begin with you, please. President Biden had his first call with President Putin today, and he was said to have discussed a range of topics, including arms control, reports of Russian bounties on U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and Russia's interference in the 2020 election. Briefly, your expectations of how Biden's relationship with Trump with Putin, that is, will differ from Trump's relationship with Putin?
I think that the relationship itself will be very different. For whatever reason, President Trump seemed really eager to buddy up to Putin and really eager to deny some of the really harmful behavior that Russia was engaged in the U.S. The fact that President Biden has appointed Bill Burns, the former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, to head the CIA, shows a side of this relationship that most Americans don't see and are still not going to see, but clearly President Biden is going to take very seriously, which is looking into exactly how much Russian interference there is in our culture, in our society, in our political system, and finding ways to tamp that down. It's been really, really problematic for the last 5 or 6 years now. We've seen from the indictments against some Russians just how involved they are in every sector of our society and trying to tear us apart. And a certain amount of what we've witnessed in the last 6 weeks with our country just being rent asunder can be blamed really on Moscow. So I think that you're going to see Biden taking a much tougher line behind the scenes with intelligence, but also forcefully and in public.
John Mearsheimer, one of the things that President Biden is said to have raised with President Putin is the arrest of Alexei Navalny and the mass protests. Is that smart? Is that strategic for President Biden to do?
I think it's actually foolish for 2 reasons. One is, and I think I disagree with Cecile here, I think the United States has a vested interest in improving its relations with the Russians and putting an end to this wild and crazy Russophobia in the United States. We need the Russians to help us contain China. And in this regard, I think President Trump's instincts were correct. We should improve relations, and we should stay out of the domestic politics of countries like Russia. This whole question of whether or not Navalny was poisoned and exactly what role Putin played in that whole episode is one that we can't assess in any meaningful way from this distance. And we ought to just keep our nose out of their business in the same way that we like them to keep their nose out of our business. People like Cecile complain about the fact that the Russians interfere in domestic American politics. Fine, but why should we then go around interfering in the domestic politics of Russia? So I'd say, by and large, don't pay any attention to that issue.
Alberto Cole, better for the U.S. to have a friendlier relationship with the Russians as opposed to one that borders on the confrontational?
Definitely. I mean, we do need to engage Russia. They exist. They're a great power. They'll continue to be. Let's think about the Russia relationship in terms of 3 chessboards, Phil. Okay. One chessboard is the chessboard of arms control. Okay. We need to be negotiating with the Russians on arms control agreements. We need to renew some of the agreements that the Trump administration allowed to lapse, like the Open Skies Treaty. We need to rejoin that. We need to renew START. The second chessboard has to do with Russia's behavior on places like Ukraine, some of their more aggressive behavior towards our Baltic allies, and Eastern Europe. And on that, we have to be very clear to Russia, as we were during the Cold War, that we have certain red lines and that we're prepared to deter them. The third chessboard is that of human rights. And I think that there we need kind of a mix of what Cecile and John pointed out. On the one hand, our leverage on Russia is very limited with regards to human rights. And it has been that way throughout the history of US relations with Russia, going back to the earliest times of the Soviet Union. It's okay to let them know that we are concerned about things like the poisoning of Navalny, but on the other hand, that cannot stand in the way of negotiations and dialogue on really strategic issues.
Cecile Shea, Antony Blinken was confirmed today as Secretary of State. Aside from Russia, what does this say about how the U.S. Expects to engage with the world at large?
Well, Antony Blinken was rather low key in his previous State Department assignments, and he is very well liked. Certainly, he is extremely competent. He is not terribly flashy, but he also understands the institution of the State Department. And I think that one thing that President Biden understands is that the Trump administration did enormous damage to a lot of the institutions that are responsible for maintaining and strengthening our democracy, whether you're talking the State Department, the Department of Justice, all sorts of other parts of the U.S. government. And so one of Blinken's jobs, and I think that this is signaled by his appointment, is to rebuild the State Department and make it able to meet the challenges that we are facing around the world right now. So I think you're going to see a somewhat low-key but highly competent Secretary of State who is also going to be focused on rebuilding the infrastructure of the State Department.
John Mearsheimer, how damaging to the United States international standing was the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th? How much did that hurt this country?
I don't think it hurt it very much, Phil. It certainly wasn't helpful. The fact is that President Trump did a great deal to damage our relations with most countries around the world. President Trump was a unilateralist par excellence, and he tended to view our allies much the way as he viewed our adversaries. He thought that they were all trying to take advantage of us. He thought our allies were free riders. They wanted us to pay all the costs, do all the heavy lifting, while they sat on the sidelines and enjoyed the benefits. And there was actually some element of truth of what President Trump was saying. But the end result is he slapped our allies around, he slapped our adversaries around. Look at his policies towards China, for example. And the end result is that our standing in the world is not very good. And I do think that one of the great advantages of the Biden administration will be that they will do a better job than President Trump and his administration did working with allies. And I think that's especially important when it comes to dealing with the China threat and also dealing with the whole question of Iran, which is another huge issue sitting on the table.
Alberta Call, let's talk about China for a second. As we mentioned, the Chinese president warned about a possible new Cold War, thinly veiled reference to the United States if these protectionist policies continued. What's the best case scenario for the United States and China?
I think the best case scenario, Phil, is a managed rivalry, a carefully managed rivalry. We cannot go back in our relations with China to what they might have been 10, 15, 20 years ago. The reality is China has become a major geopolitical adversary. And we need, even though we don't like to use that term, we need a policy of containing and deterring China. Only the United States has the military forces and the capabilities to actually deter China. China has to believe, for example, that invading Taiwan would not be worth it because it would be so costly to it that it would be a tremendously difficult thing for them to do. And that requires a rethinking of US military strategy. It literally requires what Michel Flournoy said, means that we would have the capabilities to sink every single Chinese asset in the Pacific Ocean in the first 72 hours of any Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan. So that requires capabilities at a time when President Biden is going to be facing pressures from some elements of the Democratic Party to reduce the defense budget. So yes, we have to work with our allies in the Pacific, but we are also going to have to strengthen our military posture in the Pacific. And President Biden is going to have to be able to look at China in the eye, at the Chinese president in the eye, and say, look, we want to work with you. We don't want a hot war, but there are certain things that we will not allow, and invading Taiwan is one of them.
You know, I asked you about a best case scenario. That certainly doesn't sound like a good scenario, but I know I take your point. Thank you all very much. We appreciate your insights. Cecile Shea, John Mearsheimer, and Alberto Call. And up next, indoor dining is back on the menu, but not everyone's on board. We hear from a server who doesn't think it's a good idea, so please stay with us.
What can you tell us about how Chicago small businesses are doing? These are more than just shopping centers for the community. They're gathering places where they maintain their culture.
Even without a pandemic, January and February are notoriously slow months for the service industry. However, as of last Saturday, indoor dining and drinking in Chicago and suburban Cook County are back open at a limited capacity. Some say it could bring more cash during these cold months, but others in the industry fear the health risks outweigh the possibility of more income. Joining us to talk more about indoor dining reopening are Raphael Royal, co-owner Bianca's Burgers inside the Revival Food Hall, Cynthia Miranda, who works front of house at Flow in Noble Square, and Nina Kern, a server at Fireside Restaurant and Lounge in Edgewater. Thanks to you all for joining us. So, Cynthia, let's start with you, please. You actually contracted COVID over the summer. How do you feel about safety with regard to indoor dining?
There's many mixed emotions. I want our industry to come up and get back to normalcy, but COVID is real, and it hit me, and it hit me hard, and financially it hit hard, and everyone is hurting right now.
Yeah, I'm sure. How would you say guests are about following the guidelines when you see them come to the restaurant?
You have many people that are very respectful in the guidelines and listening to the rules, and there's some people that are just very anxious to come in, and once they enter the door, everything goes right out. You know, all the rules go right out the door.
Yeah, and they tend to forget and just kind of get comfortable and settle into the comfort they're used to at a restaurant.
Yes.
Okay, so to move into Tier 1 restrictions, any region needs to record 3 consecutive days of test positivity below 8%. They need to see no increase in COVID-19 hospitalizations for 7 out of 10 days, and more than 20% of its intensive care unit and hospital beds must be available. Nina, do you think restaurants were rushed into reopening for indoor dining?
I mean, I personally do believe that we had a little bit of a rush. You know, we dipped right below the number that we were supposed to, but only by a very small percentage. I also understand the want and need to reopen the restaurants, but at the same time, I do think it was definitely rushed.
Was it surprising when you received the news that restaurants would in fact be reopening?
I was a little bit surprised how quickly from when we heard, hey, indoor dining might be opening up again, to it actually opening up. And the time that we were given the okay to when we were expected to have the dining rooms in the indoor dining open, it was a really, really quick turnaround. But luckily, the restaurant that I work at, we take COVID precautions extremely seriously, and we have a really great staff, so we were able to get it up on its feet. But it's hard for restaurants to do that quick of a turnaround.
Raphael, you and your sister, you all actually opened your restaurant in August, so during the pandemic. What's that been like?
Well, it's been really interesting. The thing that I really want people to know, though, is it was a tough time to open a restaurant, but because of the way restaurants normally operate, we're always worried about sanitation. We're always worried about making sure no one's sick. We're always making sure that the food is safe and the environment is safe. So the hardest part wasn't adjusting to new COVID guidelines in terms of sanitizing. It was more adjusting to the guest. that was the hardest part about it, because everyone either doesn't really think it's as serious as it is. And I've known several people in the service industry who've gotten sick and a few who sadly have passed away. So they made it very hard, but at the same time, people that really do take it seriously, I love them for it. And if it weren't for them, I probably wouldn't have made it, because most of my business has been takeout. So reaching out to the community and letting them know how seriously we take everything has kind of been a godsend for us.
Yeah, and we're sorry to hear about the loss that you experienced. Obviously, Raphael, Revival is a little bit different, but do you see indoor dining as being good for business?
It is a little different. The indoor dining, the Friday when it started back up, we saw a huge upswing in business. Like, people just want to be out, whether it's in a food hall or a restaurant. Or I think COVID fatigue is real. I even caught myself wishing I were out, but then thinking about it, going, wait, I want to be out, but I don't want to be out this badly. I don't want to be out so badly that I contract the virus.
Yeah, not worth the risk for you.
No.
Nina, your restaurant has a patio open as well. And, you know, for restaurants that have the option for outdoor, how viable is that during a Chicago winter?
So we have always had an enclosed patio space. So what we've done is open up that wall, one of the walls in the patio, and then we've stuck a bunch of heaters out there. And they do an okay job. It's still definitely cold out there. I'm not gonna lie to you.
What is it like, you know, having to serve in those cold temperatures?
I will be honest, it's less than ideal, but I would rather be safe and know that I can give a guest safe service and be a little bit uncomfortable.
Cynthia, Flo does not have a patio fitted for the winter. Before this, it's been relying on carryout. How do you think that's working out, and is, you know, continued carryout sustainable?
We are fortunate to have been on Chicago Avenue for over 20 years. We have a great regulars that come in, a great neighborhood that does support their small business. So we've been steady. I can't say we've been selling a lot or a little, but very steady, and we're thankful for everyone that has came in and gotten carry out from us.
Yeah. Raphael, how long do you think indoor dining will stay open? Because it seems like when cases go up, restaurants get closed.
Honestly, I hope that it stays open until spring. But realistically, just because of the way that we've handled the closures, I don't see it staying open very long, because there are so many different guidelines. Like, I live in the city of Chicago. My sister and my business partner lives in Lake in the Hills, and they're completely different guidelines. So in the city and in our restaurants, we can be as safe as possible. But until we have the same guidelines statewide and nationwide, it really doesn't mean much, because one person might be the safest person in the world, and the next person who's following their local guidelines isn't. And they're just moving the virus around the state and around the city.
Right, and none of our restaurants are on an island, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Raphael Royal, Cynthia Miranda, and Nina Kern, thanks to you all for joining us, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And still to come on Chicago Tonight, how the Loop is doing 10 months into the pandemic and after this summer's civil unrest. A woman of many firsts, the significance of Vice President Kamala Harris holding the second highest office in the nation. And 3 veteran journalists leave the Chicago Tribune. They join us to talk about their careers, the future of journalism, and what comes next. But first, some more of today's top stories. Chicago Public Schools tells parents to keep students home tomorrow as the teachers union tells members to prepare for a possible strike. The union and the district have been in marathon negotiations over expanding in-person learning options to K-8 students. Pre-K and special needs students had the option to go back earlier this month. The union told all members, though, to work remotely starting tomorrow and prepare for picket lines on Thursday if CPS locks them out. The district says it's offered additional safety measures, including priority access to vaccinations for staff working in hard-hit neighborhoods, more testing, and expanded remote work accommodations. But the union says safety measures still don't go far enough and has called for mediation. Also today, CPS announces a new program to, quote, reimagine school safety. Widespread racial justice protests last year included a call for CPS to remove Chicago police officers from schools. The district instead gave local school councils control and okayed a plan to rethink safety programs. Today, CPS announced 5 community organizations set to help create trauma-informed school safety plans, beginning with a series of 10 community engagement meetings next month. We've got details about that initiative on our website. More Chicago area counties get the go-ahead for indoor dining. Improved coronavirus metrics mean restaurants and bars that serve food in regions 8 and 9 are now allowed to have patrons inside, either 25 people or 25% capacity, whichever is smaller. Those regions include DuPage, Kane, Lake, and McHenry counties. And as we mentioned earlier, looser restrictions on indoor dining in Chicago went into effect this past Saturday. City officials said today only one business was cited for violating the rules with too many customers. And there's more about that online at WTTW.com/news. The streets of Chicago's Loop have been eerily quiet over the past year. COVID-19 has forced thousands of downtown office workers to stay home, while performing arts venues have retreated into hibernation and major events have been indefinitely postponed. But many of the Loop's small businesses and cultural institutions are still kicking. Chicago Tonight's Quinn Myers spoke with some of them about how they're staying afloat.
Terry T. has worked on Jewelers Row in downtown Chicago for the past 12 years, selling and manufacturing wedding bands and engagement rings. Located in the Chicago Landmark Diamond Center at Wabash and Madison, T's store was one of dozens in the Loop that was broken into during civil unrest last May.
It was just chaos. The window was broken all around the building.
And then, 2 months later in mid-August, T was hit again.
In order to avoid more destruction, just decided come down here with another of the building managers and just try to get people out.
Looters out?
Looters out, yes. Yeah.
Were you successful?
Oh yeah, definitely. We prevented a lot of damage at that time for the second time.
Today, the store and most of its competitors are back open, with business stable but still pretty slow because of the pandemic. Slow enough to where T has considered moving elsewhere.
If we're relying on our regular customers or our wholesale business, then we can very easily do this in another location, which would be much less in the rent.
It's a decision businesses across the Loop are facing, even as people slowly return downtown.
At the bottom of the pandemic, when it first started, we had pedestrian counts of 20% year on year, and now they're around 35 to 40%. Around the holiday, they got up to about 50%. So people are finding their way back, but it's been tough.
Most of the stores on State Street remain open, and museums are expected to follow suit in the coming weeks. But the Loop ecosystem, where one industry's success or failure feeds right into another, is still struggling.
Nobody thinks the Loop can fail, right? It's so big. It's filled with big corporations with lots of people and lots of money. But what really makes downtown go in many ways is the storefront economy. And so the store standing behind you, is suffering because there's not a lot of people down here. So our job is to bring more people down.
Like pretty much everyone during the pandemic, businesses in the Loop have had to reimagine how they operate, especially as foot traffic, once the main selling point of being downtown, has slowed to a crawl. That includes the Goodman Theater, which has pivoted to virtual offerings during the pandemic, like a recent production of The Christmas Carol. But those activities are divorced from the downtown economy the Goodman is, or was, a part of.
We produced Christmas Carol online. I mentioned how successful that was. That doesn't generate any revenue for Pederinos next door. That's where, when we come back, that's the type of collaborative approach I think we're going to have to find if we're going to be able to come back successfully.
Managing Director John Collins is also the chair of the League of Chicago Theaters and says while it's too soon to put a hard date on reopening, he's optimistic the city will work with venues to figure out a safe way to make it happen.
As we start to bring back audiences into our theaters, we can start to fill the restaurants around us. we can start to fill the hotels around us and get back to playing our part.
Back on Wabash, locally owned bakery Sugar Bliss has also had to totally rethink their business model during the pandemic.
Most of our business is corporate, and since they were working from home, they just weren't ordering, catering for business meetings and stuff like that.
After the initial shutdown, owner Teresa Ging began offering different online packages and started shipping her baked goods nationwide. So far, it's working. Sugar Bliss did better this past December than in December 2019. And like Terry T on Jewelers Row, Ging has stayed open as a foothold for the Loop during the multiple upheavals of 2020.
We have a lot of residential buildings in the Loop area, so I think they were grateful that they still had some other options to just kind of get out of the house, come and get a cupcake.
I'm glad that we have a lot of customers that support us, and I really appreciate all the help from our customers and the community and trying to keep us going. And I think if that continues, then I think everybody will be okay.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Quinn Myers.
And the Chicago Loop Alliance says they'd like to see continued government aid for businesses in the Loop, especially shuttered restaurants and theaters. You can learn more on our website. Vice President Kamala Harris has spent her career breaking barriers. Last Wednesday was no different as she made history taking the oath for the nation's second highest office. She's the first woman U.S. Vice President and the first African American and person of South Asian descent to hold the position. Here's the then Vice President-elect her victory speech in November on the significance of her new role.
While I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last. Because every little girl watching tonight sees that this is a country of possibilities.
And joining us to discuss the significance of her role and the challenges that lie ahead are Rebecca Sive, a political strategist and former University of Chicago lecturer, where she founded the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy Women's Public Leadership Initiative. She's also authored several books related to women running for office. Natasha Sharma, Associate Professor of African American Studies and Asian American Studies at Northwestern University. And Felicia Davis, President and CEO of Chicago Foundation for Women. Thanks to you all for joining us. I'm glad you're here. So Rebecca Sive, let's start with you, please. What does Harris's seat in the nation's second highest office mean for women in politics, especially considering that sector is dominated by men?
Well, in the first place, she holds the second most important executive office in the country and is one of the most important people in the world now. We've never had that opportunity before to see a woman in that role, and very few women proportionally hold executive office. The primary route of women into political office has been through legislative positions. And so I think that the second thing is she gets then to carry a portfolio of policy and legislative matters that we've never seen a woman have before in political leadership. So that's terrifically important as the administration grapples with so many crises at the moment.
And Natasha Sharma, how significant is it the fact that, Harris is she's biracial in that she is Black and South Asian. How significant is it that it is her who breaks this barrier?
I think it's really significant. And, speaking to the previous question, I think it's interesting to think about her politics on the one hand and her identities on the other hand, and they don't always align in ways that we might expect. So I think it's incredibly significant that a woman who has gotten to this position of power is not a white woman in this country. And so I think that signifies really important messages, as she said in the clip. On the other hand, while representation matters, I think that we learned from Obama that just because a person is Black or Indian doesn't necessarily mean that those are the only constituencies that she's going to speak to. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see how her politics excite or disappoint people, and also how they do and how they don't align with her biracial identity.
Now, in November, then Vice President-elect Harris gave a victory speech thanking the women who came before her. Let's listen.
Women who fought and sacrificed so much for equality and liberty and justice for all, including the Black women who are too often overlooked, but so often prove they are the backbone of our democracy.
Now, even after the 19th Amendment, Black women were still left disenfranchised in states where there were policies limiting who could vote, and that happened for decades. Today, though, Black women are one of the most powerful voting blocs in the country. Felicia Davis, what does Harris's position tell us about how far we've come, but how far we still have to go?
Thanks for the question. It's, it's really interesting. 100 years ago, some women received the right to vote. Very absent in that were Black women, and women of color were left behind. And so to have this moment, almost come full circle, where I think a lot of Black women, myself included, finally feel that this is what they have been owed for all of their dedication and organizing and reaching out to communities and holding and lifting communities up together. Now, what happens next is extremely important as well. It's about the policies that Vice President Harris supports and advocates for. Rebecca alluded to this earlier. We are in a treacherous time right now. We have two pandemics going on right now: anti-Black racism, to be clear, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it's really important that from an equity standpoint, that we center Black women and women of color in our recovery and the policies around recovery equitably, to make sure that they who have been carrying this pandemic, quite frankly, on their backs, are helped and some of that burden alleviated.
Rebecca, what challenges will Harris face that are unique to women in politics, and in this case, a woman of color in politics?
Well, I would first, I guess, speak to the challenge that of structural discrimination, which of course Felicia just alluded to, is specifically against African Americans. Secondly, the systemic gender discrimination that women in leadership continue to face. So she's going to have to confront those two facts, and people who believe that women shouldn't hold the kind of position that she's holding, much less any even lesser position. So that's sort of problem number one. Number two is the fact that it's unclear, what the division of labor will be between her and the president. And while she will be in the room with him and has clearly shown a partnership with him to date, we don't know yet what her portfolio will be, and specifically whether, as I hope it will include special attention to the issues that women and girls confront as they try to achieve healthy and successful lives. I guess the last thing I would say about the challenges is that, what kind of message is she going to consistently present about who she is and what this means for women writ large around the world. And we don't know yet what that will be and whether she'll decide to make those kinds of statements.
And Natasha, we've talked about this before, but she is the daughter of both Jamaican and Indian immigrants. How is she changing the way we think and talk about race, and particularly multiculturalism in this country?
That's a great question. She's also going to have to deal with, the expectations that Indian Americans have and that Asian Americans have for her to represent on their behalf. So she has a lot of people who are identifying with her. I think what she's also doing in her role on stage as the Vice President of the United States is really shaking up the normal ways that we think about race. We often might see her as a Black woman, and she really talks about her Indian family, her Indian mother, her relatives in India. And so she's really changing the way that we think about race as people only having one racial identity. And so I think what's going to happen is it's going to raise, on the other hand, Asian Americans' racial visibility. And it's also going to have really interesting conversations between Asian Americans and African Americans, Black and Asian communities within the United States that sometimes do not align on immigration laws and things like that, and other times really do align with regard to gender discrimination and desires for equity. So overall, I would say that she's really going to change our conversation about race with regard to the assumption that people only have one race, and also the conversation about multiracial or mixed race identity, which is the fastest growing population, with the presumption that most mixed race people have a white parent. Here we have Kamala Harris.
I apologize for jumping in. We've got so much to talk about, and the time flies right by. I was hoping to get Felicia Davis in one more time, but that means we'll have to have you back. Rebecca Sive, Natasha Sharma, and Felicia Davis. Thanks to you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Up next, former longtime Tribune journalists reflect on their careers and the future of the news business. Don't go away. Three of the Chicago Tribune's most veteran and respected writers have taken voluntary buyouts, leaving after decades covering their respective beats. Here to talk about their careers, the future of journalism, and what comes next are Blair Kamin, a Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic who was at the Chicago Tribune for 33 years, 28 of those on the architecture beat; Howard Reich, who has covered music, arts, and culture for the Trib since 1983; and Phil Vitale, who worked at the Tribune for more than 41 years and was its restaurant critic for 3 decades. And a note before we begin, Chicago no longer has a full-time architecture or restaurant critic. There's only one remaining full-time music critic. And I should also state that all of them have taken voluntary buyouts. They have not been ousted, and they're also bound by non-disclosure agreements, so we won't be getting any juice on the Trib this evening. Phil, welcome and congrats on this new chapter. Let's start with you, please. What was your most memorable experience reporting on your beat? And I'm sure it's like picking a child.
A lot like that. I was very happy to be around for the birth of restaurants such as Trio in Evanston, and for to watch the ascent really of Chicago dining and becoming really a national force. I don't think I can pick one particular moment, but it's been. I've had a really good front row seat for a remarkable time in Chicago dining.
Blair Kamin, what would you say was the biggest story you covered on your beat?
Oh, like Phil, that's the what is your favorite child question, but Millennium Park's opening certainly, also covering the opening of the world's tallest building in Dubai, the Burj Khalifa. There are just many others, and like Phil, it was a pleasure to witness the rise of stars like Jeannie Gang over the last 20 years. Again, having a front row seat to a great architectural city like Chicago is truly a privilege and a responsibility.
Howard, your work led to interviewing Elie Wiesel, which led to a book. What would you say was your biggest thrill in your time?
Well, I guess there were two. One is Elie Wiesel, getting to meet him, know him, work with him during the last 4 years of his life on our book that we wrote, The Art of Inventing Hope. And the Tribune also made it possible for me to go to Eastern Europe and uncover my mother's secret childhood Holocaust experience. And in jazz, it was proving that Jelly Roll Morton and fully 2 generations of Black composers were swindled out of millions of dollars by the white music industry.
Wow. Phil Vitale, you said you did not take the buyout 2 years ago, but why now?
It was a good time for me. I'm a grandpa now. I wasn't 2 years ago. There are more things for me to do at home. And I just turned 66, and I wasn't going to do this forever. I wouldn't say the stars actually aligned, but this is as good a time as any.
Congrats, Grandpa. Blair, same question to you. Why now?
I took it now because this was a good time. I mean, I decided a year ago that I was probably going to leave, and I wanted to get to the end of the current post-Great Recession building boom to cover the completion of buildings like the new Bank of America Tower, the tallest office building in Chicago in 30 years, also the St. Regis Chicago Tower, the 3rd tallest building in the city, also by Jeannie Gang. So those were kind of mileposts, and if I was going to leave, I wanted to kind of finish the race by, covering major stories, and so it was the right time.
Howard Reich, why was this the right time for you?
Well, actually, my wife and I have been talking about this for some years. But 3 years ago, the Tribune asked me if I'd also like to take on the classical music beat, and I just could not resist that. So I've done that for a few years now, too. I've been writing actually for the Tribune since 1978. But the thing is, since March, there have been no concerts. And there may not be concerts for most or perhaps all of this year, maybe into next year. So it's like being a war correspondent without the war. I don't have music to cover, and music is the center of what I do. And so that's why I thought this would be a perfect moment to redirect my energies on continuing working on books and films.
And hopefully there's time we can come back to your film in a bit. Blair, the last line in your column, your farewell column was this, quote, "Imagine Chicago without a full-time skyline watchdog. Schlock developers and hack architects would welcome the lack of scrutiny." Is this the last word on the importance of architectural criticism?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things that architecture critics do. The most important, perhaps, is to educate the public, just to open their eyes, to get them to look at buildings and to raise their expectations for the art that shapes how we live, really more than any other art. But certainly that function, watchdogging key developments, is a critical part of the beat. When Donald Trump first unveiled his Chicago skyscraper in 2001, it was a real dog. And, even though City Hall people were waxing enthusiastic about it, it was important that someone say this sucks, excuse my French, in order to, get the design improved. And over time, that's what happened. That's just a really important part of what we do. Criticism is about judgment. The Greek word kritikos means skilled in judgment. And somebody has to be able to say to the powers that be, whether they're in architecture, food, or culture, that, this is the real story. And that's an important function, whether, whatever your beat is, whether it's food, should I spend money on a restaurant? Should I spend money to go to a classical music concert? That's what I think one of the reasons that critics are valued. And, or if they're like Phil or Howard, they open your eyes to worlds you just, don't understand. That's why I enjoyed reading my colleagues so much, because they open the door for me to see these new worlds.
And I want to quote Phil as well, your farewell column, quote, "The work is never done. There's always another restaurant to cover, another trend to spot, another new chef who's about to make the world stand up and take notice." As Howard mentioned, the lack of concerts, the restaurant industry has certainly been upended during this pandemic as well. Phil, what is in the future for restaurants?
Hopefully survival. It's incredibly tough time for them. The Chicago restaurants have just now been able to open again indoors, but only at 25%, which nobody pretends is viable for survival. And it's going to be really, really tough. We're going to see a lot of really, really good restaurants go away. And maybe that in the long term will create opportunities for someone else, but it's not going to be a happy time. And it makes me sad.
And Howard, there is a Cartemquin Films documentary coming out based on a series you wrote. What can you tell us about that?
I'm so glad. This is my next act after the Tribune. The film is called For the Left Hand, and it's about this amazing Chicago man who, when he was 10 years old, tragically was attacked by his father and left paralyzed on his right side. But he was determined to still be a pianist. And he spent decades as a successful high school choral teacher, and never told anyone why he was paralyzed on his right side, and also never told anyone he was still practicing the piano. I heard about this guy, I wrote a 3-part series about him, and suddenly at age 78, he gets invitations to play concerts across the country, and now Norman Malone, at age 83, is a concert pianist, and this film will tell his tale.
Wow, what a story. We look forward to seeing what each of you has up your collective sleeves next time we see you. In the meantime, best of luck, and our thanks to Phil Vitale, Blair Kamen, and Howard Reich.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandis.
Throughout the pandemic, the coronavirus has disproportionately affected Chicago's Latino community. WTTW News Director and Chicago Tonight Latino Voices host Hugo Balta moderated a virtual community conversation last night about COVID-19's impact and available vaccines. During the conversation, Miguel Blancarte Jr. of Esperanza Health Centers talked about the importance of migrant workers in Illinois getting the vaccine. Here's a short clip.
We need to ensure that they get vaccinated as well. because farm workers in rural Illinois are the essential workers of Chicago, of our cities, right? And it's extremely important. We see the disparities of how COVID is impacting essential workers in the city of Chicago, how COVID has been impacting not only with high positivity rates, but morbidity rates as well of Latinos who are in the essential, who define themselves as essential workers. And so for farm workers, we need to make sure similarly that they get vaccinated, that they have access to the vaccine as well, because they're part of the infrastructure of the state.
And again, that was from last night's virtual community conversation about COVID-19's impact on Chicago's Latino community. You can watch the full conversation on our YouTube channel at WTTW Chicago. And be sure to tune in to Chicago Tonight Latino Voices Saturday evenings at 6, and mark your calendars for our next community conversation on Monday, February 22nd, which I will be hosting. And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that's proud to serve its community through pro bono legal services.